What we're going to do is we're going to use our calipers here in a minute, and what we're going to try and do is use the calipers in a way that you almost never see. In fact, I've never seen it, but I use it this way. You can use the calipers and pinch it in between here and measure things. You can pinch the internal thing that way, or you can use this as a blind, hole to figure out, what blind holes are. Well, what we're going to do is use it in a unique way where we're going from the head out here to the tip out there. So we're going to use this and measure that. And if you really want to know, and you're lucky enough to have a larger set of calipers, then you can take a larger set of calipers and tell exactly what that is. So let's line this one up to 0, make sure it's all clean in there, and we're going to just say 0. Okay, so that says 0 right now on there. It should say 0. Now it says -1. Trying to make sure. Okay, 0, negative 0.01, that's fine. What we're going to do is we're going to measure with a much bigger set of calipers. So, take our meditorial calipers here, and we're just going to actually measure calipers with calipers and see where we are. So, I'm doing this just to show you this is how long these Syntec calipers are. Truth is, it doesn't really matter. We're not going for an absolute distance, and if you look, it's around 236 millimeters, or switch to inches, it is 9.2895-ish, somewhere in there. So if that's important to you that you get the exact distance, all you have to do is add this to this amount to the amount that is on your Syntec calipers that come with your 3D printer kit. So anyway, we're going to get rid of these larger calipers. We don't really need them, but I just figured I'd show you the true length of this would be adding that 9.28 inches to whatever this ends up. So that would give us the total distance between these. And then on top of that, what we're going to do, we don't want to use super sharp tool steel to scratch our acrylic. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of blue tape and we're going to put it on both ends of the calipers. So take a little piece of blue tape here, and we're just going to tape over the head of this, and hopefully it sticks. And there we go. And all that's going to do is that's going to keep this from scratching any of our acrylic pieces there. So I'm going to do the same to the back side, because the back side's actually even sharper. Chances are it's not going to want to stick, but we're not using it at 0 anyway. So get the tape off of there. Okay. Okay, so now that we got that, we're going to actually take this tape and we're just going to stick it on the end of there and kind of overlap it, because we're not going to actually retract this all the way. What we're doing is actually using this as a very accurate kind of feeler gauge from this end to that end. And so long as all 6 points are the exact same length, basically this is going to be used as kind of like a no-go, no-go gauge, or a very, very, very long feeler gauge. So in engineering terms, a feeler gauge is something where you kind of feel that it's right where it should be by putting it in there. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of like line one of these up, and we're going to tighten it up. So let's take all of these in here, make sure they're all out to the edge like we wanted them to. Just going to kind of tighten them up a little bit on all of the 4 corners. And what we're really interested in doing right now is we're going to take one side, pick a side. Well, let's try this one. We're going to tighten up all 4 of the bottom 4 rods. We're going to tighten up just one end of it. And so you're going to need your 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter wrench, and you're going to need your adjustable wrench to be able to do that. And keep it very flush on this one side here. Then we're going to tighten this up. So put that on there. You just go from one to another. And wrenches, adjustable wrenches, just so you know, you always tighten towards the point. So you tighten towards the point, or if you want to loosen it, you pull it off and you loosen it. And it's actually stronger that way than if you were to try and you know, tighten it backwards. So just a little bit of trivia there. We're not doing anything that's super hard here where we're going to put a lot of torque on it, but if you ever do, it's kind of nice to know. Okay, so when we tighten this up, we tighten it up kind of tight, but not super tight. I mean, if you really crank this over, you can actually put so much force with these 5/16 inch bolts that you can actually crack the acrylic, but we're putting it, you know, fairly tight. So what we'll do is line that one up, and then we're going to kind of wiggle the whole thing. Make sure these are all loose on all those, and then we're going to do the same thing with the bottom. So finger tighten it first. Let's go to the back. Finger tighten those first, and we're going to make sure these are loose. That one kind of tightened up a little bit, and same with the back. And we're going to do the same with the bottom, where we tighten it finger tight first. Now we're going to take our wrenches and we're going to tighten them up. And truthfully, it's easier to tighten with the stationary combination wrench than to keep tightening and loosening the adjustable wrench. So let's go ahead and put this on there. And tighten it up. You only want to go maybe 1/8 of a turn after it's, you know, kind of cinched on there. That's about as tight as I ever want it. They don't really loosen up over time. If you wanted to, you could always get a little bit of Loctite and put on the nut when you're installing it. But same way with the back side. Tighten that up a little bit. And we're going to go to the bottom. Do the same thing. And we're not concerned at all with the top right now. Okay, so now what we have the four corners of one side, the bottom of one side, are all tight, but the rest of the machine is still loose, okay? And that's very important to be able to get these tightened up right. We want these three rods, the three longest rods, still loose, which they are. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go and try and find whatever the lowest point between these two are that gives us a flush bolt there. Okay, so it looks like we get a little bit of wiggle room. We're going to tighten that up on each of these four a little bit, and you keep going back and forth, and what it's doing is it's actually massaging this panel and moving it towards the outside bolts by doing it this way. And once we get there, what we're going to do is use our calipers. And we're going to use this as reading, but we really don't care what it reads so long as it's consistent on all four of those. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to put that up against the acrylic and try and keep that as level as possible from one side to another. And once we get there, that says 2.830. Okay, what does that mean? Not much. It's just a reading, but it's a relative reading from one to another. If you want, you can actually take that and you can zero it. So go back, get these in between, and we want to make sure that it's as in line to that bolt as possible and that it is straight as possible. And so we're going to zero that. And all that is, it says 0 inches. Okay, whether it's 0 inches or 0 millimeters, we're not really caring about the scale. We just want to know that in a relative term that that's all accurate. So we're going to go to the bottom. Make sure that you don't line up onto the washer, but instead you line up to the nut. That's actually pretty good. It's 0.01 inches or negative 0.31 millimeters, so that's pretty close for that side, and we would expect it to be fairly close just because those washers are close. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to flip this around, and we're going to try and do just a generic test on the back side and see. Hey, what do you know? It's a positive 0.39 millimeters on here. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually tighten up the outside a little bit and bring it in. So loosen the bottom inside one and the top inside one, and we're just going to slightly tighten this up a little bit. We're going to read what it says on here, and right now it says 0. We're going to try and get it to go to 0.0. That's a little bit too much. And what you do is you adjust the inside and the outside of the nuts till you get this so that it reads 0 on all four of the outside and inside pieces. So what we're going to do is just keep doing this. It takes a little bit of fiddling around, but far, far less than a regular Prusa kit. Okay, and so we're going to actually tighten this up a little bit. Just one side. And we're just going to keep working on that a little bit. And it's still negative slightly. So we're going to actually loosen up the outside just a little bit at a time. And move the inside out. Okay. And then remeasure it and see. And right now it reads 0 millimeters. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that same process on all four of these until we finally get them all to be, you know, it doesn't have to be 0.00, but the more accuracy that you use when you actually put these together, the better your printer will be able to print. So but once you get that close and you're under a ½ millimeter difference, it's really, you know, it's hard to tell the difference on the printer, the prints there. But if you ever go and you want to enter a design contest and you want the absolute best prints possible, making sure that your printer's all lined up is the best way to do it. So that one's pretty close. It's 0.02 millimeters, so we're going to kind of tighten it up now. Tighten the inside a little bit. Outside a little bit. And once you find out that one side of these is tight, then you really don't need a wrench on both sides, you know, until you're ready to totally tighten it down and ratchet it down really good. So we're just going to kind of tighten a little bit, same on the inside and the outside. And we're going to go back through and remeasure these and see that nothing's given. It says about negative 0.01 millimeters. So that's about as tight as you can possibly get it. And the bottom says it's 0.036 millimeters. So we might be able to tighten that up a little bit. But let's turn it around again and do the same thing. Okay, we're going to go back to the top, which is 0.01, which we would expect not to have changed. But it's always good to recheck. Then on the bottom, it is, and you really got to watch how you line it up. Try and line it up from one side to the other pretty good. Actually, it's 0.01 millimeters. So we're going to tighten that all up and then measure the whole thing again, and we should be good to go on the bottom. Bottom is really tight on this side. Now let's make sure we tighten it on here. That should have been pretty tight already. And what we want to do is try and go the inside and outside at the same angle, if you can understand what that is. And if you have to, you can raise the printer. You just don't want the tools to actually touch the acrylic pieces. Okay, so let's go through and measure those again, just to make sure that hasn't drifted any. And I mean, if it's 0.1 millimeters, that's far, far tighter tolerance than you could ever get with a Prusa, standard Prusa with printed parts on it. And the reason is because the top to bottom part of just the surface area is that close. Okay, so there we go. Go back here, remeasure, and tighten both sides. Yeah, that hasn't moved. That hasn't moved. So we're going to go ahead and tighten this up really good. Make sure we tighten both sides, just because as you flip it around, it's hard to remember which side you tightened and which side you didn't. And go back to this side. That's pretty tight. It's kind of fiddly sometimes to get that just right. Okay, so now what we want to do, we want to do the same to the top, but with the top, and if you look, some of these bolts here might be sticking a little bit out that way or a little bit inside this way. That's fine, so long as the distance in between all four of these are the same. And we're going to do the same with the top part here, but with the top part we have a little added complexity to it, and that complexity is that we need the ends of these bolts to be the exact same. So it's got to be centered is what we're looking for, and the way to do that is to make sure that the inside dimension is the same and that the outside of both of these are actually the same also. And one of the ways that you can kind of do that a little bit is to put the Z motor mounts on there, but they're not 100% accurate. So what we're going to do is, before we even put the Z motor mounts on there, we're going to kind of line these up, and we're going to check using our little feeler gauge that we had before, and we set it at 0, 0, just kind of make sure that that's about where it's going to be. And so we put it in there, make sure it's kind of lined up, and we zero it again. We're just going to kind of take that to the top and see where we're at with that. So now this says that it's about 2 millimeters off, and so it's going to need to be a little bit tighter. That one's 1.78, so it's not so terribly off. But what we're going to do is we're going to do two things. One is that we want this inside dimension on the top to be the same, but then we want this side and the other side to be the same also for the amount that actually sticks out. So what we're going to do is just kind of use our calipers, get rid of the tape if you have to be able to lock them down to where you need them to be. And we're just going to kind of do a quick measurement, turn these off, and see where we're at with these. And so this one says, and we're not going to try and scratch the acrylic, but it says 71 millimeters on that side, and it's a little bit more, or a little bit less on this side, maybe about 69. So, okay, well, so we'll just kind of move it over a little bit. Looks like about 70 millimeters would be about it on both sides. Yeah, that's pretty close. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of tighten up these washers and the nuts. So it gives us a good starting point. So, okay, so we already know that we're going to have to move them in 2 millimeters on that side and about 1.78 on this side. So we leave it a little bit loose on the inside. Okay, do the same thing on the back side of here, to make sure that these all line up on both sides. So if you're lucky, both these rods would be the exact same length, and so both of the front and the back would be the exact same, on all four. But anyway, let's check and see where we're at. And I can't emphasize enough how nice it is to be able to keep checking and seeing. I mean, you reach a point where it doesn't do you a whole lot of extra good, but what we're going to do is we're going to line up both of these and just kind of lock them in place. So let's tighten that up a little bit. out there. And once we get that kind of so that they actually, you know, physically are finger tightened around there, then it's going to stop this from flapping back and forth when we measure it. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and we're going to take one side of this and line it up so that we get about the exact same. And the good news is that this doesn't have to be exact. You know, we're going to end up putting a nut on the back of here after we put the another washer, the Z motor mount, and then another washer and a nut. So this doesn't have to be so super critical, but the inside dimension here between the two inside panels, that is critical. I mean, you really want to make sure that it's, you know, plus or minus a ½ millimeter would be just fine. I like them a little bit tighter than that because I like to be able to produce really good prints. Best way to do that is to, you know, make an accurate machine that is very, very capable of creating those kinds of prints that you want. So, okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to leave this side this time loose a little bit. We're going to tighten up both sides on this because it's the exact same distance here right now as it is on the other side. And so take your wrenches and get the adjustable wrench set and then tighten that up. Same deal as before. After it gets, you know, pretty tightened, and I'm actually moving both sides at the same time, then you go about 1/8 of a turn, and that's about all the tighter that you want to actually make the acrylic. So do the same thing with the back. Okay, and that's pretty tight. Let's measure this again, make sure. Shouldn't have moved, and of course it did not. So now what we're going to do next is we're going to actually loosen this up a little bit, and we're going to put our tape back on the back side so we don't use this to actually score into the acrylic. And then we're going to remeasure the bottom because we already knew that we were, you know, within 1/10 of a millimeter before of all the corners and stuff. So we want to make sure that it's in there pretty good. And zero it. And check it 2 or 3 times just to make sure. Re-zero it if you have to. And we're going to go back up. We're going to go back up here, and we're going to check and see how far out we are. And, you know, you can check on the inside of here. I usually kind of like the outside part here. You just got to make sure your fingers are out of the way. And make sure that that tape still sticks. Okay, well now it says it's about 1.5 millimeters off. And so what we're going to do is we're going to actually tighten with our finger the outside part. And you'd be amazed at how quickly it changes just by finger tightening this. And so it's actually tightening it up pretty good just by doing that. And let's loosen this one up a little bit. If you have to, use a wrench, and we're going to tighten that from the outside, loosen from the inside. I'm going to loosen this one up, make sure it's plenty loose, and make sure this is all pretty much the same going across, you know. And as we tighten it up, we're going to try and get, I don't know if you can see this, but try and get it down to 0 millimeters, or 0.0 millimeters even. And we're going to loosen this. And as we loosen it, it really makes a big difference, you know, in tightening and loosening. And in a second here, we will be at 0. And if you go too far, you can always retighten it back up. Okay, and then just spread it by hand. And right now, we are at 0.01 millimeters, which is about as good as you can expect. So, and depending on how hard you do this, you know, 0.05 is fine. And let's check the other side. We're just going to flip this all the way around, because now you can start to see this frame's really getting tighter. So, same thing on this side. we go through and spread this out, and you see right now it says try and get it as square as possible, 0.12 millimeters, so it's just slightly over. So we're just going to do the same old trick. Actually, it's on this side we need to tighten now. And you're going to have to keep spreading it just to make sure. And we're reading 0.02 millimeters now. And depending on whether you tighten or loosen, it'll change it, plus or minus 0.01 millimeters. And even in the way that you check it, you want to make sure that you're consistent. So by checking it there, it says 0.05 millimeters. That's really, really tight. I mean, that's a tighter tolerance than you could ever get on any sort of normal RepRap printer. So we are at 0.0. Sounds good to me. Okay, so now all we're going to do is we're just going to check briefly, make sure everything's tightened up, and we don't really expect to move any of these. If we do, we'd go back and readjust it. None of them, of course, are moving. Okay, now that it's so much closer, you'll want to check both of the bottom side and kind of like just by eye, kind of move those over and then tighten up these so it gets it a lot closer to where it should be. I might have to hold it by hand just because there's nothing else holding it on there. Yeah, that's pretty good, I guess. While this is the frames like this, you see it's pretty rigid right now. I mean, it doesn't have much give or take. By the time it actually gets all the extra rods and you get the Y-axis bed and stuff in here, this frame really tightens up considerably. So now that we've got all 6 of the corners here that are accurate, let's go ahead and complete off the Z-axis here that we were going to build on here. If you get a washer that has like a little nick or something in there, sometimes in their stamping operation they do it. It's not a big deal. Usually I kind of like put it on here where you won't really see it too much, so usually kind of towards the bottom or so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put a couple washers on here. Doesn't matter whether you have which side goes in or out because it's going up against a plastic piece. And then instead of the traditional way of a pressa where you actually mount a motor down into this pocket here. That's just a little test I did earlier. Instead of it actually mounting in the pocket like here, that creates a problem because the problem is that when you have these screws, they have like a bar clamp here or a rod clamp, then the screws end up hitting the motor and actually moving the motor or making the motor go off kilter. So that's not a real good design that way. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to gain about a ½ an inch, 12 millimeters or so, by flipping this upside down. Mounts just the same, and so now I'll actually right on the top instead of up underneath. And by the time this thing all gets compressed, you won't hardly be able to even see the vibration isolation pad. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these upside down instead of the regular way that normal people do it, and we're going to just kind of assemble those on here. So let's make sure that we've got our washers in there, and find one more washer here. And we're going to go ahead and slide that in there. And the key is that when you get it in there, you want the little dimple on the outside. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that on the other side too. Sometimes it helps to do all operations that are identical at the exact same time. And you see it's a little hard. You can pinch the rods a little bit sometimes to get them on there. Okay, so you will have a washer on the acrylic, a nut, and then a washer on both sides, okay, so that they're the same. And then what you want to do is you want to put some more washers on the outside. So we're going to go ahead and do that. The washers on the outside here. And then we're going to go ahead and put the nuts on there. And right now we're just going to finger tighten it, okay, on all four. The good news is that this dimension isn't that terribly critical. It's more critical that this is actually just not loose than anything. So we're just going to kind of finger tighten it on here. And then we'll tighten it with a wrench once we get all four of them finger tightened. Okay, take your 1/2-inch wrench, make sure, and here you don't really want to ratchet this down terribly. I mean, all it does is hold the Z motor, and so once it's tight, I mean, maybe go an 1/8 or 1/4 turn, you know, past where you can finger tighten it, and all that does is that just holds that where it needs to be. So we're going to do the same thing here, just wherever it finger tightens up to, we'll just do a little 1/4 turn. And that's good enough. I mean, they are plastic parts, and there isn't any structure in between here that's going to hold it, so just kind of tighten it a little bit. And if you keep tightening it up, eventually you're just going to bow this, and it's not going to do us a whole lot of good. But then our motors will actually line up on the top part of here really nicely. While we're doing that, we might as well also install our rod clamps. And so you can do it the rough side up, or you can do it the smooth side up. The smooth side is actually the side that was on the printer bed. Rough side is what's called watertight, you know, so it shows that it's a 3D printed part. I kind of like the smooth side, so we're going to do that on the top. And if you have to, these are pretty tight tolerance in there, but they're a looser tolerance in here. So why that is, I'm not exactly sure, but if you have to, you can go ahead and you know, try and finger tight what you can, and then beyond that, take your Allen wrench and you just kind of screw it in there with the Allen wrench. So let's do one side first, and then we'll do the other side. So I just kind of keep going with it. And what we're looking to do is just get it far enough in so that it can actually go beyond here. And then we're going to put a nut on the back side. And the good news is that those nuts actually have what's called a nut trap on the back of here. So we don't really even need to use a wrench on the back side. So long as it's up tight against the plastic, it'll work itself into where it needs to go. So let's kind of see if we can get this to go in here. Okay, so it's going to take a little bit of time to get this to work through there. You know, maybe someday if we rework that bar clamp, we'll actually loosen up those tolerances. But you see, as you slowly tighten this up, that it goes around. This is one of those times where you can actually just go ahead and use the bigger side and just keep twisting it. And eventually, it works its way far enough that it will actually go on the inside of that. So if you wanted to, you could actually have inserted the nuts into the nut trap before we put those on there, but truthfully it doesn't really matter too much to me. I've done it both ways, and it doesn't seem to be a time saver either way. So okay, so that should hopefully be enough that once we put this on here a little bit farther, and we can get our nut in there. And all we're doing right now is just getting these mounted on here. We don't really even care that they're tightened or loose. All it is just to keep from losing the pieces, because eventually we're going to put our smooth rod is actually going to go through this hole down here, and then there's a bar clamp on the bottom. In a minute we're going to actually put that bar clamp where it needs to go, and then we will be good. Okay, so it peeks through just a little bit on the inside, so what we're going to do is use our thumb here and try and hold that as we tighten this. I'll back it out until it kind of hits that nut trap a little bit. Okay, let's do the second one. And right now all we're really trying to do is just get the nut on there, so we don't really care, you know, that it's tightened up or anything. So there we go. Okay, so there's one side. Let's turn it around and hit the second side here. Sometimes if you're lucky, you can actually just, you know, finger put this right in place into that nut trap. And sometimes you're not, so let's just leave that out for a little bit. We're going to do the same thing on here, so we're going to just take these two screws and put those on the inside of here. Keep working that in there until we can slide that into the holes there. And if we're lucky, we can get this nut to fit on the back side there. It's a little bit harder, but try and find the right screw for it. There's one. And we're not looking at tightening it up, so we don't really care that it's, you know, so super tight or loose or anything. We're just trying to get it on the end of that bolt. There it goes. Okay, for now we're just going to leave that there, and there's that part. Okay, so for the inside of here, we want it to be so that this side dimension is the same as that side dimension, and then we're going to tighten it up. What we don't want to do is we don't want to flare it so that we're pushing out or pulling in, and we don't really even care what this dimension is in here because it's really not critical. All that's critical is that once it's tightened it up, it makes the frame even more rigid, and it keeps the Z-axis lined up to where it needs to be. So anyway, let's go ahead and try and get that. You know, using our calipers, once again, we can, if you want, you can put a piece of tape on there. And all we're trying to do is just, you know, get a rough determination of where the exact same part is for one side or the other. So we're going to just measure one side here as it sits. And it doesn't really matter, we're just going to zero it. So let's go ahead and kind of tighten this up a little bit on that side, tighten it on this side. That way it'll give us a little bit of a bearing as to where we're expecting to be on here. And so we can see that we're just slightly shy of where we would like to be. We need to go about 1.5 millimeters that way, you know, because it's 3 millimeters off. So I'll just loosen it a little bit and slide it. Actually, loosen this one. And let's see where we're at right now. About 1.5 millimeters, 1.2. So let's readjust this and zero it, and go back over here. That's 0.2 millimeters off, and quite honestly, that is not a problem at all, because all this is going to have on the bottom part of here is just the Z-bar. So if you wanted to, 0.2 millimeters is just fine. And so we're going to see, we're going to measure it again. Make sure you don't hit the washer when you measure it, but that you're actually just hitting the acrylic sidewall. I'm going to measure both sides. The funny thing is, we grind these edges of these things, so one side might be slightly off versus the other, but truthfully, that is just fine. So we're going to zero it one more time once we get it on here, and check. And go back. And it says 0.01. Hey, that's perfect. So once again, we go through. Now that we know where that is, we're going to go ahead and just tighten these up, because we don't really care about this inside dimension here. If we flared it out, you know, a half a millimeter one way or the other, it's just not going to matter. So, but what it will do is it will stiffen the middle part of here really, really well for your Z-axis, especially the Z-axis smooth rods. So let's go ahead, finger tighten them, because what that does is that, you know, puts zero stress on it before you go ahead and you tighten it up really good. Okay, and you want the top and the inside and the outside of that to go at the same amount, about 1/8 of a turn after it's finger tight, and there you go. That side's stiff. So now you can see this frame is really getting stiff. Last thing we want to do is we want to use, you know, our nuts and a couple of the washers, and we're going to actually put the bar clamps on there. So let's go ahead and do that. And the good news is that once we get these bar clamps on, we are done with this assembly. So I go a little bit farther. And right now, we don't really care about the distance of this, so we're just going to kind of leave them loose in there. And it's not until we actually get the Z rod in here that we're actually going to measure it in between, and we're going to tighten those up to where we want them to be. So, oops, get that on there. Turn it over. Once again, we do a nut, washer, bar clamp, and a little bit further in, another washer, and a nut. And with that, we are done.